We saw you.
We saw it. We'll tell. We'll tell.
Come on, face up. Opposition looks keen. What? Opposition looks keen.
The House has resumed. The House is debating the third reading of the Dairy Industry Restructuring New Sunset Provisions Amendment Bill, and Shade Ardern has the call and has 9.5 minutes remaining should he wish to avail himself of the opportunity.
I'm not sure I'd make myself popular if I did, Mr. Speaker. But
Shane Ardern.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the Dairy Industry Restructuring New Sunset Provisions Amendment Bill, I think it's probably fair to put a little bit of context around it and talk about what's broken and what are we trying to fix. And effectively there were three issues that were bothering the Board of Fonterra and the government alike. One was that the original Act, the 2001 Act, had the potential to expire sometime in the not too distant future, as set out 10 years ago when it was first put in place. That was the triggers that triggered, I guess, the expiry clause were close to being met in the South Island at least, and probably a year or two away in the North Island. So the government looked at that and decided that the dynamics of the dairy industry outside of what is controlled by Fonterra were not strong enough as yet, and for that reason decided it would be suitable to extend the period that the DERA Act stayed in force. The other issue that was a major issue amongst the farming fraternity, the shareholders of Fonterra, was the price that the DERA milk was being sold for. That is, that the formula being used to set that price had developed into what was being seen by the farmers or the shareholders of Fonterra as a subsidy to the other companies that were able to pick up that 50 million litres per company of milk. And so a price was set at Fonterra farm gate price plus 10 cents. The 10 cents was put there to take into account the recognition of a loss of opportunity on the shoulders. That is, a dairy season typically goes up with a sharp peak and comes down again on the far side with not such a sharp peak, but tapers away. And of course, if you can pick up milk as a processing company at the low points of that shoulder, if you like, then you have a substantial advantage. And so it was recognised that that was a cost to Fonterra, or to the shareholders of Fonterra, and I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves at this point, because people talk about Fonterra as though it's some conglomeration of international executives, etc., when in fact what Fonterra is a farmer cooperative owned by 10,300 shareholding farmers. So 10,300 individual small to medium-sized businesses, some of them could be described potentially in New Zealand as large, but certainly not internationally, who own this company, and they were subsidising, and MAF I think in the end accepted that was the case, subsidising the 50 million litres because they weren't getting a fair return for it. The further point that this bill addresses was the fact that in the South Island, to establish the trigger levels, the Westland area was excluded from the catchment that was measured in terms of the trigger. And in this case, in this bill, it's prescribed as about 80% of all milk collected in New Zealand going through Fonterra, which is referred to in the bill as Newco, because that was the name it was given when the bill was first put in place, prior to the name Fonterra being introduced. So the Westland area, the Westland Regional Council boundary, I think it is, or Territorial Authority boundary, was excluded. And the reason for that was because Westland was one of the original companies that was part of the Dairy Board when the merger of two major companies in New Zealand took place, including the Dairy Board. And so Westland chose to stay outside of that. And up until recently, I think about 2 seasons ago, they chose not to collect the 50 million litres of milk which they were eligible to collect under the DERA law because they never believed that that was in the best interest of New Zealand. But because the DERA legislation was likely to be extended, they submitted to the Select Committee that it was a commercial disadvantage to their company not to take advantage of that 50 million litres. And so they've chosen now to do so. And they collect milk from mid-Canterbury and cart it across to Westland and process it there. So the argument that Westland should stay outside of the total catchment of the South Island because there was no real competition in that regard was now null and void. And so the area of Westland has been included in the total catchment area for the South Island now to establish when that trigger will be met. There are a range of other issues that have been addressed during the discussions, Mr Speaker, but I think I will leave those to another time. I'm sure there'll be further debate in the dairy industry going forward and potentially further legislation, and so it's our intention to support this legislation, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker.
Brendan Burns.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.